Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Spoken Worth. Thank you for watching the Spoken Worth podcast. Click like on this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and keep up with each week's episode that we release every single Sunday at 7 o'clock p.m. But if you're watching this week's bonus episode, thank you. You matter, you're loved, and you rock. Enjoy this week's episode. It's actually a bonus episode, but enjoy it. Thank you. We wanted to do an episode for Good Friday. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. It's on suffering. Enjoy. Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into it. We wanted to do an episode for Good Friday. It's Holy Week this week. We did an episode for Palm Sunday, and Good Friday is this Friday. And so, in light of Good Friday, we really wanted to think, what did we want to talk about in regards to Good Friday? Do we want to do a Bible study lesson? Do we want to look at some of Jesus' journey to the cross? We're doing that as a congregation. We're doing a journey to the cross night where we get together and we go through Jesus's betrayal, denial, his accusation, his aloneness, his suffering, crucifixion, and his death. But we really wanted to do something more brief for the episode. We wanted to do an episode where we really just talk about this portion within this concept of suffering. And suffering is a huge concept. It's a huge concept that we could spend a lot of time talking about, and we probably will. And we want to bring in podcast guests. We want to bring in people for those episodes to really share their stories and to talk more about suffering and what we learn about suffering. But we wanted to nonetheless still kind of touch on this idea of suffering in regards to Good Friday. And so we thought it was relevant because there's a lot of suffering in the world right now. There's a lot of suffering that is going on. There's a lot of pain and hurt and chaos. There's a lot of people questioning if God is real, but no one is questioning if suffering is real. And many times suffering is actually what leads us to question if God exists or if God is real. And so the purpose of this episode is to identify a new perspective around suffering so that we would draw closer to God when we suffer rather than fall further away from God when we suffer. And so in this brief episode, we want to really kind of have 2 points here. And the first point we want to look at is suffering is often our justification for blaming and questioning God or pushing him away. And I just want to preface this brief episode with this. If you are someone who's going through an immense amount of suffering, if you're someone who's suffering in a big way right now, this episode probably doesn't pertain or isn't as much for you. And I don't mean that in an offensive way. What I mean is, I'm not trying to say that I have the perfect answer for suffering. I don't. That's why I'm saying we're touching on a portion of suffering for this episode. And so if you're suffering in a big way, I definitely believe the first response to suffering is just loving someone and being present for them and listening to them and allowing them to grieve and to heal and to mourn in a healthy way. And so I'm not trying to police anybody's pain. I'm not trying to tell them that their suffering is this or it's that, or that they should respond this way or they shouldn't respond that way. I'm simply just saying and making a point about a portion of suffering that I believe to be true on some levels. And so suffering in a lot of ways is a lot of our justification for blaming and questioning God. A lot of people question God because of suffering. And really, a lot of us in life want God to remove our suffering. And I think we see a story in the Bible in John chapter 11 of something similar to this, of something very similar to this. In John chapter 11, when Lazarus has died, Jesus waits a certain amount of days before going to visit. And when he goes to visit, he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, of course. But he gets there, and when he gets there, his family is upset. Lazarus' family is upset. They're crying. Martha, Lazarus' sister, says this to Jesus in verse 21, and I find it very profound. I find it profound because it gives us insight into really what she was pondering and questioning in her heart, and I think that's something we can connect with. In verse 21, Martha's brother Lazarus says this. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." That's a big statement. And a lot of times we breeze over this passage and we just jump into the part where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And certainly that's a significant thing to raise someone from the dead. That's worth emphasizing. But what's worth emphasizing also is that she is making it clear to Jesus that if he would have been there sooner, Lazarus would still be alive. On one hand, we can say, wow, that's impressive. She had a lot of faith in Jesus. She trusted that Jesus was powerful enough to heal Lazarus or keep him from death. That's a big deal. But understand, she's on the same, on the other side of the coin, she's not questioning Jesus's power or his ability. She is certainly, though, questioning why he wasn't there sooner to stop Lazarus from dying. She said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." See, Martha was wondering, does Jesus care? And if he does care, wouldn't that have meant that he'd be here sooner and prevent Lazarus from dying? If you would have been here, he would not have died. It's a statement of faith because it's saying, I trust that you can keep him from death, but it's a statement of, why weren't you here sooner? It's a statement with some accusation in it, with some emotion behind it. She's upset that Jesus wasn't there sooner to keep Lazarus from dying. She was upset about her suffering, and she connected it to Jesus and his moral character. And I believe a lot of us do the same thing. I believe a lot of us think, if you would have been there for me, this would not have happened. God, if you would have been here sooner, if you would have showed up in this way, this wouldn't have happened. Or I wouldn't be suffering in this kind of way. But see, the beautiful thing that we're failing to realize when we see suffering as some type of punishment is we fail to realize that suffering is an invitation into intimacy. And that's the second point that I want to talk about in this brief episode. Suffering is an invitation into intimacy with God. God doesn't promise to remove our suffering, but promises to be present with us in our sufferings. See, Jesus, before he ever raises Lazarus from the dead, he weeps with the family. Jesus is sending a message that presence is greater than answers. God doesn't promise to remove our suffering, but promises to be present with us in our suffering. And see, everyone loves a friend who stays by their side when they're going through a hard time, but it's even better when the friend truly understands what you're experiencing and going through. Sometimes we would rather not have anyone around at all during our suffering if those who would be present with us in our suffering had no ability to understand or relate to us in our suffering. But the good news is this, that Jesus truly understands everything we suffer. Why? Because on Good Friday, Jesus dies on a cross. Jesus steps into suffering on the most supreme level, on the most sacrificial level. He supremely suffered. He suffered a life of continually sacrificing himself for others and ultimately sacrifices himself on the cross for our sins. Presence is greater than answers. God wasn't willing to remove the wilderness from Israel, but rather he chose to walk with them and guide them through and in the wilderness. God doesn't remove our wildernesses, but rather he walks with us and in and through the wilderness, experiences it with us. God is more than just some all-powerful and almighty being. He is an all-relational and all-loving being as well. God doesn't promise to remove our suffering, but he promises his presence in the midst of our suffering. And he proves that through the suffering of Jesus on the cross. That is why Good Friday is called good. Good Friday, it's insane that we call it good at all. It's a day of the highest injustice where the most innocent man is crucified and tortured to death and actually exchanged for a convicted murderer. They sent home Barabbas to take Jesus to the cross so that he could be killed. And yet we can still call that day, that event, that period in history, Good Friday. Why? Because that is the day that Jesus makes it very clear to all of the world. The deepest question that they have is does God even care? Is God still with us? God cares to the degree that he's willing to suffer with us. God is not going to remove our suffering. He is going to suffer with us. But ultimately, we learn this. Although he's not willing to remove all of the suffering within our life, he is willing to remove the suffering of sin and death. He is willing to remove the thing that is most suffering. Sin and death. There's nothing greater than that when it comes to suffering. And Jesus is willing to remove that. He's not going to remove all of our relational problems or all of our problems at work or all of our problems at home or all of our problems around us. He's not going to give us the best boss, the best job, the best house, the best things. But what we can guarantee is that Jesus can save us from our sin, and ultimately he can save us from death. And that's why it's called Good Friday. And so suffering is actually it's an invitation into intimacy. We shouldn't push Jesus away. We shouldn't push God away because we suffer. We should draw closer to God and closer to Jesus in our suffering because Jesus suffered with us and for us. And so what's the application? What's the so what to this episode? The application, the so what, is very simple. Don't blame God for your suffering. Look for God to reveal himself to you in your suffering, because he's present with you in your suffering. And he wants to show himself in a way that's really, really awesome and will lead you to a more intimate relationship with him. And also, and I kind of alluded to this earlier in the episode, stop trying to give someone the right answer to their suffering and focus more on being present with them and for them. A lot of times we try to give, as Christians especially, we try to give people a book, chapter, and verse that they can turn to and read to kind of take away their pain and their hurt and all their suffering. But a lot of times what we need to do is we need to just sit and be present with them and be willing to step into their shoes and listen to them and feel their pain with them and feel tender for them, because Jesus was willing to do that when he went to the cross. Jesus was willing to step into suffering at the most supreme level by going to the cross and suffering on our behalf. And so instead of trying to give people the right answers, give people the presence that they're longing for in their suffering. And be willing to accept that not all suffering is explainable. Not all suffering is explainable or reasonable. There's not always a reason to our suffering. And what I mean by that is Jesus suffered. And there's a plan to that. God had a purpose for that. But my point is, we're always looking for the answer or the why to our suffering. But even if we had that answer or had that why, we would still have to go through what we're going through. We would still suffer. So not all suffering is explainable. Don't blame God for your suffering. Look for God to reveal himself to you in your suffering. Stop trying to give someone the right answer to their suffering and focus more on being present with them, and be willing to accept that not all the suffering that we go through is going to have a perfectly packaged explanation or reason behind it. But in all of our suffering, there's a perfect God that's waiting there for us and willing to embrace us and love us and even suffer with us. So, on Good Friday, the Friday in which the most innocent man suffered the most horrendous death, understand that we can call it good because he was willing to suffer with us, for us, and save us from sin and death, in which causes the most suffering, more so than anything else in human history. God is a good God. So let's draw closer to him, let's praise him, and let's tell someone else about him this day. Blessings.